we'll be talking about trauma, and sometimes that can be difficult. But just to let you know, we feel like we're able to talk about trauma in a way that isn't re-traumatizing. We're not talking about graphic details of abuse. There's a time and a place for that, and this workshop is not that time or that place. And so keep that in mind in the chat as well. We'll be asking some questions along the way. If we're asking for examples of experiences, just bear in mind, we don't want to prevent or present kind of graphic details that might be challenging for other people's nervous system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's move into a little bit of just what we have planned for everybody tonight. We're excited about this. We kind of have three main things that we're focusing on, and we'll just go through that quickly. We want to explore examples of adverse religious experiences and power and control dynamics within religious systems. We also want to explore or discover how religious trauma functions within each of our nervous systems, or different ways that it can function. And then finally, we want to learn some of the common features of trauma physiology, as well as just some strategies for supporting the nervous system. So those are kind of the three overarching themes, and then we'll be talking about some different stuff within each one of those.
Yeah, perfect. I hope we can get to all of that.
Yes, we'll talk fast.
Yeah, and so some folks might be wondering, what is the Religious Trauma Institute? It just kind of sprung up out of nowhere, and it's been a project that's been in the works for years, and it just feels like the timing's right to move forward and kind of expand the conversation about religious trauma from this more trauma-informed perspective. And so we are licensed mental health professionals, graduate students, academic researchers, advocates, and survivors. That's kind of the encompassing group that comprises who we are and who we're, supporting it and providing resources for. We're passionate about understanding, treating, and preventing adverse religious experiences and religious trauma. Our goal as a group, as an organization, is to expand the conversation to include more clinical voices, to include voices from a diverse range of survivors as well, as we realize that, what our unique experience isn't always representative of other people's experience. And so we want to really expand the conversation and bring more people's voices into this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of all of our announcements and all the housekeeping stuff. So before we get into this, I want to just take a moment, and we're going to just do a grounding exercise. Part of this is so that we can give you guys a skill that you can take with you into your world and into your life, but also so that if there's anything that we're talking about tonight that feels particularly triggering or uncomfortable, that you also have a skill that you can implement right here and right now to kind of bring you back into the present moment. So if you feel comfortable, and you guys are all over the place, so nobody's even watching you or hearing you. Yeah. So I'm going to just kind of lead you through a really brief grounding exercise to get us all here. And I'm going to ask you to do a couple things that you can do inside. You don't have to speak it out loud, or you can speak out loud too if you want. So as you are just here in this chat room, in whatever room and space that you're in, just kind of look around you and notice and name 5 things that you can see. Maybe you name the color of something. There's the yellow pillow, the red placemat
mug here.
Yes. The 5 things that you can see, and just really notice the details of that. And then look around and notice and touch 4 things that you can touch. Notice the texture, how something feels against your skin or your body. Maybe notice how it feels to have your feet on the ground or to be in your chair, what that feels like. So 4 things that you can touch. And then identify 3 things that you can hear. So maybe tune out the other things around you and just really focus in. What are 3 things that you can hear in your space right now? And then let's engage our sense of smell and notice 2 things that you can smell. And really just take those in, inhale them, and notice that. And finally, identify 1 thing that you can taste. Maybe it's that sip of coffee or your dinner, and just really savor what that taste is. And just notice that as you're engaging all of those senses, that it's bringing you back here into this moment, and ready to really begin our presentation.
Yeah, I love these type of exercises that invite curiosity and openness. So much, often trauma feels very stuck and closed in, restricted, and sometimes just simply turning our head sideways is this way of moving from this defensive orienting to more kind of exploratory orienting can be a really great resource for our nervous system. So yeah, thank you so much for that, Laura.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's kind of dive in here. And what are adverse religious experiences? This is kind of a term that we've come up with that we feel is maybe a bit more useful in terms of not just looking at religion categorically, but like what are these component pieces that are adversive to some folks in some situations. And so we have a bit of a definition here. An adverse religious experience is any experience of a religious belief, practice, or structure. And so it's kind of encompassing. We can see that would encompass a lot of experiences inside of religion that undermines an individual's sense of safety or autonomy, or negatively impacts their physical, social, emotional, relational, or psychological well-being. And that's kind of a mouthful, but we think about all these various kind of experiences that we can have as humans inside of an organization, and we're noticing, the impact they have on us. And we're hopeful that by focusing through this lens, we can start to see what types of experiences correlate to harm, what types of experiences create a context where trauma is more likely to occur. And so that's kind of what we're talking about when it comes to adverse religious experiences.
So given the definition, we would love to hear from you in the chat box what some examples of adverse religious experiences are that you've had maybe in your own life. Again, you don't have to, please don't go into graphic detail, but we would love to hear from you. What are some things that you go, oh, this would fit as an adverse religious experience? And we'll read through a couple of those as they start coming in. Being a part of the purity movement, big time.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, purity culture. Constant fear of hell.
Sure.
Yeah, big time. Conscious eternal torment.
Mm-hmm.
Being that taught that our body and our thoughts and our emotions can't trust ourselves. Yeah. Separation from family, growing up with a fear of hell. Can't do something because of I'm a woman. Altar calls. Where you miss God if you don't participate. Fear of being rejected or tortured. Believing the wrong thing. These are amazing. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, speaking in tongues. Okay.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for this feedback. Yeah.
Yeah, these are amazing. And what I want to present to you next is something that we created called the Religious Power and Control Wheel. And this is a document. I modeled this document after the Power and Control Wheel for domestic violence. And this, I want to just be really clear, is not the be all end all of adverse religious experiences, but just wanted to give you an idea of what some potential adverse religious experiences are, like kind of the categories that they fit into. But before we go into kind of like reading through what some of those things are on the wheel, I wanted to just talk really briefly about what power and control is. It's a dynamic. And it's really what fundamentalist, legalistic, patriarchal, abusive systems are built on a foundation of power and control. So the very nature of how these systems were created is designed in a way that requires individuals to change or even forget who they are in order to be a part of this system. And so within religion, the systemic control, it can sometimes be very unique. And in the way that it's not uncommon to hear religious leaders claiming to either speak on behalf of God or their higher power, that their higher power is infallible and has all the answers. There's a tendency towards mind control and really this inability to trust yourself. And it's creating this dynamic of power and control. There's a lot of tribalistic thinking, us versus them, with this notion that people outside the system are dangerous. And oftentimes is solidified by threats of punishment. And so we go, when these dynamics are at play, we have a foundation of power and control. And what's interesting in these systems that can be kind of sometimes difficult to recognize is that as we look at the power and control wheel, and I'm going to just go back here one slide. That's okay. Any one of these little behaviors in and of themselves might not actually be a big deal or might not be identified as particularly harmful. But when we start to put multiple of these behaviors together and stack them all up, we start to go, oh yeah, there's really something wrong here. And so I'm going to just give you a couple examples from each one of these categories of different forms of power and control that could be adverse religious experiences. And then we'll kind of move into that. So we'll start with loss of autonomy, and just like some ideas of what loss of autonomy could be would be like shutting down your intuition or personal thought and opinion, this inability to trust yourself. Isolation could be things like needing to cut off relationships with people outside of the system, or maybe an increased level of commitment, required commitment to the system's activities. So they're really requiring your time. Minimizing, denying, and blaming is part of power and control. So this could be something like calling something a sin versus abuse, or a sin issue instead of abuse. It could be that they require you to forgive somebody, or that you have to take ownership for how somebody else's actions have harmed you. And that would be minimizing, denying, and blaming. Emotional abuse is present in power and control. So this could be something like name calling, even something like, you're a sinner, you're worthless. That can be emotional abuse. Being required to suppress certain parts of yourself, again, being told that you're not allowed to trust yourself, and that you actually have to rely on external control in the form of God or clergy or the religious system. Spiritual abuse is part of power and control, and that could be that you're required to submit to spiritual authority, being given reasons as God or the higher power says so, or the Holy Scripture says, and this is why you have to do something. Threatening consequences if you sin or break the group rules. Those sorts of things are all fall into spiritual abuse. Threats. Okay, sorry, I'll follow the list here. Sexuality and gender defining could be, defining really rigid gender roles, inherent sinfulness of specific sexual expressions, very strict gender binaries, requirements of purity. Those would all be sexuality and gender defining in power and control. Economic control could be requiring a portion of your paycheck that has to go to the religious system, maybe unpaid volunteer hours at the expense of other commitments are required. This idea that you have to trust God to provide and for your needs rather than maybe taking personal action or charity. And then finally, threats, accusations, and intimidation could be, if you leave the church or you leave this religious system, the devil is going to get you and we're not going to protect you, or maybe not allowing you to seek outside help, like in the form of like medical help or therapy or the police. And so these are just different ways that adverse religious experiences can happen under this dynamic of power and control. And like I said, this is not the be all end all, but this is just a really nice way, a concise way of categorizing it.
Yeah.
And so when these things happen, we also know that it happens within the context of what's called a cycle of abuse. And so I wanted to just take a few minutes to go through this, and I'm going to go through relatively fast. A lot of these, we can come back to these documents in future presentations.
Sure, yeah.
But when we talk about a cycle of abuse within a religious system, we're talking about some specific things that are happening that kind of have a very predictable pattern and very predictable things that are happening within this. And so this, again, is borrowed from the Duluth model of how they educate for domestic violence, but we've worked with this within the religious context now. And so I'm going to just explain each one of these phases: the tension building phase, the explosion phase, and the honeymoon and recommitment phase. And you might find yourself in this. You might say, oh, I can see now certain things that happen to me. Maybe this is the first time you're ever hearing of something like this, and that's okay. But we're going to actually start with the tension building phase. And what that is this phase within the cycle of abuse where there's maybe a decreased tolerance for not learning or applying religious teachings. There's maybe increased rule following that has to happen, decreased explanations as to why certain things are done. So it's maybe like, well, the higher power says so, or the holy texts say so. There's a focus on decreased reasoning, like self-reasoning, self-logic, a decreased sense of self, really kind of villainizing critical thinking skills. This is where we start to really be taught what to think versus how to think. There's an increased submission to authority, increased self-blame and shame when there's incorrect or sinful actions that are happening, increased requirement of compliance with the group behaviors and rules and those sorts of things, a decrease in being able to ask questions or share doubts and confusion, and then also an increased dependence on external authorities. So we have to look to maybe clergy or religious leaders to tell us how to act and do and be and feel, which also then results in a decreased sense of self and a decreased ability to trust yourself. And so that's the tension building phase. And when that's going on, it's like the tension starts to build and build and build and build until there is inevitably an explosion. And that feels like a really big and powerful word, but it's this period of time where it's kind of like, like the lid pops off, if there's like the steam is boiling and finally it boils over. And so just some examples of what the explosion phase in an abuse cycle might look like would be punishment or trying to punish for like sins or uncondoned behaviors, threats of excommunication or disfellowship, or actually trying to remove somebody from the religious system. It could be public humiliation. So that might look like you're required to repent or disclose your sinful behaviors, like to the larger public group. Requiring you're being required to take ownership for things that have happened to you, and take responsibility for your part in what happened, including abuse. And threats of what would happen if you don't take responsibility for the harm and abuse done to you. And then sometimes during this explosion phase, there really is also sexual abuse, physical abuse, or physical violence, sexual violence, those sorts of things. And so we look at this and we go, well, gosh, if those things are happening, then obviously somebody would leave, right? Because that's really big and explosive and really dangerous. And sometimes, yes, that happens, but most of the time people don't leave, because what comes right after the explosion phase is what we call a honeymoon or recommitment phase. And this is a time in the system or the relationship where there's reconciliation between people, there's repentance, maybe on both parts, apologies, promises that this isn't going to happen again. Maybe some of the concerns that we have are addressed. There's a reconciliation or repentance plan put into place. There's placating statements that are made like, we're doing this for your own good. You're just a baby believer. You don't know any better. And, there's promises of restoration of relationship and a nostalgic focus on all the good things that have been in the past. And also with this phase is a recommitment to this idea that the religious system knows what's best for you. Mm-hmm. And so it's this really connective, like kind of good feeling stage in the abusive cycle that loops people back in and goes, oh, maybe it wasn't that bad, or I could take ownership for this. And I really do like what they provide for me, or the connection that I feel. It really wasn't that bad. And so it kind of loops us back into the cycle. But we know that just like relationships between humans, the honeymoon phase never actually lasts forever. Mm-hmm. And so it's only a matter of time before the tension starts to build again, and we start repeating that cycle. And so it's really easy to look at this now from an outsider's perspective, and we go, okay, so if this is what's happening and we've got all this power and control dynamics going on, well, like, why does somebody stay in that? Why would somebody choose to stay in that? That feels very bizarre, right? Yeah. And so what I usually tell people is that question of like, why does somebody stay is usually the incorrect question to ask, because it also assumes that somebody would want to stay in an abusive system knowing that there's abuse going on. And that's usually not the case. What's important to realize is that when we have this dynamic of power and control, and somebody's trying to get out of that, this is not a bad breakup. This is not just, I can leave and not go to church anymore. Power and control is a dynamic where one person or party or system has psychological mind control over an authority over an individual or a group of people. And so they're able to control and dictate your thoughts, your actions, and how you view yourself, how you express yourself. And so it's important to know then that getting out is not just about leaving. And so to that extent, like, there's 7 main reasons why somebody would stay in a relation or in a religious system like this. And I'm going to list them off, and then I'll go through them really, really briefly. The reasons that people would stay is because of brainwashing or indoctrination, hopes, dreams, and possibilities, denial, fear and terror, family, friends, and relationships, love, and culture's positive view of religion. So really quickly, what brainwashing and indoctrination might look like is, I said it before, this idea of a religious system teaches people what to think versus how to think. And when somebody is told a message over and over and over, and especially when they're born into that system, that message or those messages become neurologically wired, and our body responds physiologically and psychologically to these messages that can create really adverse experiences and impacts when you're trying to leave or do different things other than what you've been told is the right way to do them. And oftentimes when this happens, people can interpret that as a sign from their higher power with that they shouldn't leave because there's this adverse response. And abusive systems are quite explicit that they're the ones who teach the right way and the truth and the correct way to think and feel and live. And so this can cause a lot of suspicion and debilitation for those who are trying to get out. So people stay because of brainwashing and indoctrination. They stay because of hopes, dreams, and possibilities. Most people know nobody or no system or no church is perfect. And so there's this idea, if I can just accept the flaws, then it'll be okay. Victims of religious abuse and religious systems are often taught that they should expect suffering here on earth. And that's actually a sign that their higher power loves them and sees them. In Christian traditions, there's this idea that God punishes those he loves. And so they go, well, if I can just make it through this time and endure this suffering, we're going to come out the other side, and God is really going to bless me for that. And so we stay because of hopes, dreams, and possibilities. We stay because of denial. So victims of religious abuse might believe that they've not experienced, because they haven't experienced, say, physical or sexual abuse, that what they're experiencing is not abuse at all. Or they might subscribe to this idea that because God has placed somebody in authority over them, that the treatment that they're experiencing is all part of God's plan, and that that person knows better for them. Or they might believe that because they're taught they're completely depraved, there's nothing good about them, that they actually deserve this sort of treatment. And so people stay in these systems out of denial. People also stay out of fear and terror. So that could be they're terrified that if they leave this system, they're going to spend an eternity in hell. There can be an overwhelming feeling of having to start over. Oftentimes, there's not a lot of education and skills that are taught in these systems. And so it can feel really, really scary of like, what would I do if I get out of this system? I'm not sure. There could be fear of retaliation from the religious system, that the religious system may try to punish them for leaving, or potentially like bad mouthing about them, spreading rumors, lies, maybe using their influence in the community to not let somebody get a job, those sorts of things. And oftentimes too in power and control dynamic systems, you're isolated from the world, and so you're told that everybody else is evil and out to get you. And so there is this really real fear that they would have no idea how to function and would actually be harmed outside of this system. So we stay because of fear and terror. We also stay because of friends and family and relationships. So a lot of people in these systems have their entire lives, their relationships, their social community that are there. And so to leave would mean they have to leave all of that behind, and that they're really isolated and alone in the world. And there is a very real fear that they would be unable to live life without that support system. And so they might stay for the support in those relationships. And then actually there's two more, sorry. We stay out of love because we believe that God loves them. And in a lot of abusive systems, love and abuse are very close together. And so abuse equals love. Mm-hmm. Many victims of religious abuse truly love God, and they really love their church. And so they really want to be there. They want to show their love by staying and by enduring. And then finally, many people stay in these systems because of culture's view of religion. Traditionally, religion is viewed through a very positive lens in society, which means that a lot of times victims of religious abuse and adverse religious experiences aren't taken seriously. They're told that their problems aren't real. Also, we live in a very religious society where oftentimes you can feel really triggered because aspects of our society, like holiday breaks, or in the US, Chick-fil-A being closed on Sunday, or having to say the Pledge of Allegiance, it all goes back to religious traditions. And so you might feel that you never are able to get away from it. And so those are kind of the reasons why somebody would stay in a religious system. And so what I want to do now is kind of transition between, because we want to talk about trauma. And so how does this all relate to trauma? So again, the things that we've talked about are not extensive. That's not the be all end all. But these are things that can be adverse religious experiences. And so what we know about trauma is that it's subjective and perceptive, subconscious, and embodied. And what that means is when we look at these adverse religious experiences, we can experience these things, and everybody can have different responses to them. And so two people, say siblings, can grow up in the exact same environment with very similar things happening, and how their body responds to that, it might be very different. One person might be able to walk away relatively unharmed, and another person who heard the same messaging and grew up in the same family system walks away with a very, very different experience. And so what that means is that just because some of these things have been experienced does not actually mean that your body or nervous system is going to register that as traumatic. So it's really kind of that reason that we go, hey, we've got to expand this conversation a little bit, because while there are many people that can just change their thoughts and beliefs and walk away from that, there's a great many other people who go, these are the things that I've experienced, and my body is having a different response. I can't seem to get away with that. or get away from that. And that's where we start to need to talk about religious trauma.
Yeah.
So
yeah, so I think which is a really great place to be. This question of is this abuse trauma? Are these adverse religious experiences? Does that equal trauma? And I guess not exactly.
No.
maybe trauma in this kind of colloquial sense, where it's like, you experience a traumatic experience or you experience some abuse, but not in the sense of what we're talking about when it comes to trauma. This is that physiological response to the event. It's that experience that lives in your body, that lives in your nervous system, that persists long after you've left or escaped the abuse from happening. Yeah, I think it's important to make that distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I guess it brings up the question, what is religious trauma? And so how we're talking about this, and there's many ways to talk about trauma, of course. And we're looking at it through more of a clinical lens and more through, the title of the workshop is religious trauma and the nervous system. What does this look like in your body? And so, I think it's a physical, emotional, or psychological response to, again, religious beliefs, practices, or structures that overwhelm an individual's ability to cope and to feel safe. I think it's just important to recognize that, as Laura was talking about power and control dynamics, in order for us to feel safe in the world, we need to have a sense of autonomy, a sense of power, a sense of we can do what's necessary to protect ourselves, to be safe. We can say no to things we need to say no to. We can push people away that need to be pushed away. We can maintain a sense of kind of personal integrity. And that's when we're not able to do that. Often that's where trauma lives. And it's in that kind of powerless place of I can't do what's necessary to be safe in the world. Yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I love this slide because it just encapsulates everything that we're talking about.
Right. And I think this is part of this a bit of a shift in the conversation to talk more about what trauma looks like, what the experience of trauma, as opposed to, just religious abuse, I think those distinctions are important. Is this making sense to folks? I think the ability to do a poll here. Let's see.
So as Brian's pulling this up, we're adding in a poll that we would love for you to participate in and just answer yes or no. This isn't making sense. So you can see that at the bottom there.
Yeah, there we go.
Ooh,
awesome.
Good.
21 votes. Wow, that's quick. So why is this distinction between abuse and trauma so important? Are we just splitting unnecessary hairs? Are we, a distinction without a difference? Like why are we distinguishing between abuse and trauma? And I think it's important for a lot of reasons, and it's important for a lot of different kind of groups of individuals. How many people have heard a believing friend or family member say something like this, right? I wasn't harmed by religion, implying that therefore your experience of trauma inside of religion isn't valid. Or at least there's this kind of idea, it doesn't make sense to me. I believe the same things, I had the same experiences, and yet my nervous system feels fine. And so there must be something wrong with you. And we get into a bit of, victim blaming and shaming inside of that space. And so when we talk about the difference between abuse and trauma, we can start to have more informed conversations with our believing friends and family members. And so we're not talking about the doctrines themselves. We're not talking about the abusive behavior itself. We're considering that, we're kind of factoring that in to our understanding, into the conversation. But we're also introducing this idea that, your physiological response to the event, that's what's resulting in the trauma. And so we can have a conversation where it didn't harm you for whatever reason, and whether it was additional internal or external resources, various combinations of support in your environment. And we're not here to decide why one person experienced trauma or not, but we are very interested in acknowledging that trauma is real and trauma is this response to an event. And so I think believers, for them, it can be helpful to make that distinction.
Yeah.
Does this sound familiar? As a survivor of religious trauma, why do I still have a visceral reaction when folks talk about hell or insert any doctrine or any kind of adverse experience that you had in religion? And when we don't make a distinction between abuse and trauma, we sometimes are left with the impression that if I just leave the abusive situation, then I should be good, I should be fine. Or if we could just kind of get rid of these harmful religious practices, then survivors are going to be safe and okay again, and they'll move on. And that's not understanding how trauma works. Trauma is this experience where I needed to do something to protect myself, defend myself, and I wasn't able to do that. And that sense of powerlessness that your nervous experience, that freeze collapse response, persists until you have the experience of being powerful, being strong, pushing away, doing what's necessary. And so making the distinction between abuse and trauma is really helpful for survivors as well. Getting over or recovering from moving through religious trauma isn't about, getting all the counter-apologetic arguments in line or, proving to yourself that it isn't true, because trauma doesn't care whether it's true or not. Trauma is that physiological response to the event. And so it's important from that perspective as well.
Yeah.
And if you're no longer part of a religious group and you've spoken to maybe someone who's been secular all their life, an atheist, and sometimes they'll say things like, why are you afraid of something you no longer believe in, right? And there's this kind of idea that that this trauma or this abuse lives inside of the story or inside of the language or inside of the belief. And it simply isn't true, right? When you learned about hell as a child, it wasn't just the words, it wasn't just the doctrine, it was your physiological response to that. I feel overpowered and overwhelmed by something that I can't do anything about. I can't protect myself. And that physiological experience to a real or perceived threat persists in your body. And we need to do something about that. Physiologically, we need to support our nervous system in ways that it can kind of recover and move forward. And so when we start to talk about, when we're not making the distinction between abuse and trauma, we come up with these notions that feel more shaming and blaming than useful. And so I think that's why it feels really important to make that distinction.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to kind of recap that, like, why are we talking about religious trauma in the nervous system? And I think first and foremost, it's because trauma is not just in your head. Like Brian talked about before, trauma is a physiological response that your body has.
Yeah.
And so the way I always say it is trauma is not the thing that happens. Trauma is the response that our body and our nervous system has to the thing that happens. So we know that it is not in your head. If it was, it would have a timestamp on it where we would be able to move forward. But we know that that's not the case. And so trauma is not in our head. Trauma exists in the physiological response to the events that we're experiencing. And because trauma is very subjective, it means that what might be traumatic for you may or may not be for me, and vice versa. And both of those experiences are valid. Yeah. And then finally, we talk about this because we can't think our way out of trauma. It's not a matter of just necessarily like leaving the thoughts and the beliefs and the practices behind. When trauma lives in our physiology, we have to heal it through our physiology as well, which it can be helpful to think different thoughts. It can be helpful to believe different things, but ultimately the healing happens within our nervous system.
Yeah, for sure. I think those distinctions are really important. In ways, often survivors will feel very stuck or powerless inside of the recovery process, because if we're trying to come up with a better story or a better explanation of why I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing, our body doesn't care so much about that. Our body doesn't speak, with words in language. It speaks with sensation and with this felt sense experience. And so if we're not able to give our body what it needs to feel safe again, then we can kind of get stuck there. And so we think about what does religious trauma look like in the nervous system. And we'll just go through and describe kind of 3 physiological states that we experience as humans that have an evolutionary history, that are adaptive for humans, depending on what they're reacting and responding to. And so you can imagine trauma in the nervous system when you're feeling safe and strong and social and connected. And, like, what does that experience feel like when maybe you're with a friend who cares deeply about you and you just have that kind of, a big sigh of relief, like I'm safe and I'm okay. And so like, this is the kind of, from the polyvagal theory perspective, this kind of ventral vagal state, physiological state, where we humans are safe enough to connect with other humans. Yeah. And by default, if we think about, we humans are so focused on survival, right? Because it makes a great deal of sense from an evolutionary perspective. It doesn't make sense for us to be in the same room with other humans without wanting to fight them or run away to safety, because they represent a potential threat to us. This safe and social physiological response is something that evolved within mammals and allows mammals to be in groups. It allows us to kind of put a brake on this, kind of instinctive response to run away or to fight. It says, I'm detecting enough cues of safety that I can be connected and be safe here. When we think of that in a religious context, there are a lot of folks who feel very connected and very safe, and it feels okay. And there's nothing that triggers that or feels like a threat to them. And so we can notice like that's a completely, common experience to have for some folks inside of religion. And so we look at the next, what happens when we detect a threat, when we're in this kind of fight or flight response. And most of us are familiar with this, racing heart. Our stomach starts to feel queasy as the blood moves away from our internal organs to our arms and legs, so we can fight harder and run faster. And we're just kind of maybe bracing or preparing to do what's necessary to protect ourselves. And we can notice like that response might feel very similar to that really, horrific altar call service where the evangelist, depicted some really, horrific experience that you're going to have if you don't give your life to Jesus. And so we can have this fight or flight response. And if we're able to effectively run to safety or to neutralize the threat by kind of pushing back or fighting, then our body goes back to feeling safe and social again. Like, I feel strong and powerful. I left that service. I told that person that is not okay what you're doing. I will not tolerate that. This is not for me. And when we're able to do that effectively, this is why power and control is so important. If we're able to neutralize that power and control, then we get to feel safe again. However, in the next physiological state that we experience is this place where we can't fight or escape safety, where the system's too big, the circumstances are too powerful. It would be unsafe to run away. And when mammals are in that physiological state, this is very similar to the predator is chasing the prey, and just before the predator attacks, the prey will kind of feign death, this kind of collapsing and freezing. And there's a lot of stuff that happens in the nervous system when a mammal is in that state. They don't feel as much pain. The muscles of the inner ear change so that they hear, loud, high frequency and low frequency sounds. You talk to folks who have experienced trauma in this way, and they'll describe not being able to hear human voice because that kind of mid-range, is not detected by their inner ear, which is fascinating to think about how our body is preparing for the end, essentially. Like, this is so overwhelming that I can't survive. And this is also where kind of please and appease exist, or feigning and fawning. This, can I make my oppressor okay enough that they don't hurt me anymore? Yeah. And we can think of that in terms of interpersonal relationships inside of a religious context, but we can also think of that as this persistent sense that I'm not safe, I'm not okay. And that can show up in the form of doctrines, that can show up in lots of different forms. When we're talking about religious trauma, we're talking about this physiological response that's adaptive. It's designed to keep us, help us survive. It's not necessarily a sense of feeling safe, because in this freeze collapse response, it often feels like we are trying to fight or flee to safety. And our nervous system is putting a brake on that, this sense of it's not safe to run, so you better not run. And then that feels like this massive amounts of kind of energy, for lack of a better word, that I need to do something. This isn't okay for me, but I can't do that. So we imagine a metaphor of, pressing the brake and the accelerator at the same time. It's incredibly overwhelming. And there's a sense of powerlessness, a sense of helplessness, a sense of being stuck and trapped inside of that. And this is where, mammals will dissociate, disconnect. Our bodies secrete additional chemicals and hormones that will, reduce the sensation of pain. And that's why we don't feel as much pain sometimes when we experience something very traumatic. And so we start thinking about what this looks like in a religious system. We don't have to really point at, well, this particular doctrine puts people in freeze collapse universally. But we can recognize that if there's this aversive control that doesn't allow a person to feel safe and powerful and autonomous, that's going to have the potential to result in religious trauma. And so I think that's why we're talking about the difference between abuse and trauma, and also really connecting this back to our kind of physiology as mammals. And we can't, like we talked about earlier, we can't outthink this. We can't think past it. We can't reason with this. We have to give our body what it needs to feel safe again. And I think that's the important work of recovering and healing trauma. Yeah. So this is just kind of reiterating what I just said. This, trauma exists in a lot of different forms, but one of the most common forms is that persistent feeling of helplessness or powerlessness when you weren't able to do what was necessary. In recovering from trauma, it often requires a physiological response to that, of being able to approximate or physically carry out the sense of I can do what's necessary. I can run to a safety. I can push someone away. And then that sensation of safety or power results in feeling safe again. Yeah.
Awesome. So one of the things that we wanted to do is, we're talking about all this information and it's great and everything, but it's kind of like, all right, what do I do with that? Yeah. So we wanted to just offer you guys just a couple things of, how do we support our nervous system when our bodies have experienced trauma, or we're living out of a feeling of constantly feeling traumatized. And so we just came up with a few ways, that you can support your nervous system. And the first one is awareness. And that is just a simple curiosity, a simple noticing, beginning to notice maybe different sensations that are happening within my body. Going back even to the beginning when we did that grounding exercise, what are the things that I notice around me that I can see and feel and hear and smell and taste, and just starting to bring some awareness into this space. It's this idea of what is my body telling me, or what do I notice about what my body is telling me, and beginning to develop some internal awareness also. So what am I feeling internally? Yeah. So that's one way that you can begin to support your nervous system.
And I think the beauty of that, Laura, as you're describing that, is if our body is not using language to tell us what's going on with it.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Using the sense of sensation, there's a whole rich and varied language of sensation that our body is like, we're tensing up because there's a threat, and we're relaxing into feeling safe, and we're noticing this uneasiness in different parts of our body, and like what is that doing, and how is that impacting us, which kind of takes us to the sense of another kind of skill or principle that we can focus on is we can support our nervous system with movement, and this can be something like going for a run, or it can be something like yoga. But also I want to expand that out a bit further. So trauma often feels stuck. It feels intractable. It feels like I can't do anything. I'm powerless. And so if we start to notice those sensations with that newfound awareness, I'm noticing what my body's feeling and sensing in any given moment. Within the experience of trauma, sometimes I feel like I'm stuck here, right? I can't move, I can't do what's necessary. If we sit with a sensation for a bit, noticing, does it become more intense? Does it become less intense? Does it shift or change? Does it change where I'm feeling that in my body? Even if something feels like it's getting more intense, that sense of movement, that awareness of movement, there's some hope inside of that. Oftentimes we tense up before we jump, before we act, before we do the behavior we need to do. Can we notice that kind of constricting and becoming more intense and constricted? Can we notice like that maybe it's the possibility of doing or acting in a way that would serve our need for safety again? And so I think working with trauma clients, often we're really focused on tracking movement. It's not, in fact, I think in some ways, a success is movement. These physiological states I described earlier, we don't live in any one of those states all the time, at least not ideally. And so we will be safe and social as long as we can. But when we detect a threat, we're going to move into kind of this activated state. And then if we can resolve the threat, we'll be safe again. If we can't, then we'll maybe move to a place of feeling, freeze, collapse in the service of survival. We don't want to live there either. So what do I need to do to move out of that state? And so this movement in and out of the states is a quote unquote healthy nervous system that's able to move without getting stuck in the states. And so movement in that sense, I think, can be a really important principle to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's awesome. And then even building on that, after awareness and movement, is supporting our nervous system with safety. And when I talk about safety, I do mean external safety, but I first mean internal safety. And that's being able to develop a sense of internal awareness and peace and calm and safety within your body, that when different sensations come up or when movements come up, that I'm able to nurture and calm myself, that I'm able to recognize what's going on and provide for myself what I need to feel just a little bit more safe in that moment. If I'm really agitated, would it help if I went and took a walk, or grabbed some tea, or took a bath, or connected with somebody that felt really helpful to me? And so we support our nervous system by starting to understand what helps us feel safe internally. And subsequently, we also start to look for external safety. And so that could be and needs to be some really basic stuff of like, do I have my basic needs taken care of? Food, water, and shelter. Sure. It doesn't have to be an abundance of that. It just, are those needs being met? Am I in a physically safe environment where I'm not at risk of being physically harmed, or those sorts of things? And then we also look at safety then within relationships. Are there other people that my system can connect to, that I feel safe with that person? So I might be around this person and I notice that I just start to feel relaxed, or maybe there's another person where I'm around them and I just start to feel really amped up and anxious. And so it's starting to notice that, when I feel really amped up and anxious, like, that might not be a person that I need to be with right now. And I can create internal safety by taking the break that I need and giving that back to myself. And so, supporting our nervous system with internal and external safety is for sure key.
Yeah, we have one more slide here before we move into question and answers, and I'm noticing the time. It's been an hour, which is crazy how fast it's kind of flown by. And so I want to let folks know that we'll be around for questions and answers at the end. Feel free to stick around as long as you want. I know we talked about this being an hour, so if you need to leave, feel free to do that. But we'll continue moving forward here and wanting to get to some of your questions as well. This one might seem a bit counterintuitive. And so I want to kind of unpack this just a little bit, supporting your nervous system with aggression. And so if we think about, what we need to feel safe and powerful and strong in the world, we need to have access to a sense of power and control in healthy aggression. When we're in these various physiological states, the freeze collapse state versus the activated state versus the safe and social state, when we're in this kind of freeze collapse state, we likely want to be in safe and social, but we can't get there physiologically. Our nervous system will not allow us to feel safe and social until we move through this activated state. And so when folks are feeling frozen and collapsed, and it starts to feel like this anger is building up, this sense of injustice. I need to do something. Something needs to be said. Something needs to be done. If we stigmatize that, if we say you're not permitted to speak out against what you've experienced, or say no to folks who you need to say no to, we're essentially keeping folks trapped inside of this helpless freeze collapse state. And so when we think about aggression, we're not talking about actively trying to harm somebody or being vindictive in any way. We're saying that when someone is pressing against me and it's not safe, I need to be able to push them away and say, no, you're not permitted to be this close to me. I will reject that. I will push you away. When we're able to engage that kind of activated state, this really powerful and strong, which also feels, for a lot of trauma survivors, feels unfamiliar. It feels risky. It feels unsafe, because maybe when they've pushed away in the past, they've been punished for that, or they've gone back to feeling freeze collapse. And so part of what folks to keep in mind is, if we can support your ability to push away, to say what needs to be said, to do what needs to be done, and to feel safe enough doing that, that aggression can be in the service of connection. Because if I can say to maybe a loved one who constantly reminds me of religious doctrines and maybe messages that says you're going to hell, or something's not okay with you, and when I notice that when I'm around them, I feel very much like it's risky, it's scary, it's not okay. If I can push them away and say, no, you will not speak to me that way, I will not have this conversation with you. What that does, we might think that's burning a bridge or pushing someone away, or ending a relationship. The reality is, if your nervous system feels powerful, that allows you to move into a place of feeling safe again, then if you chose to interact with that person again, you wouldn't instantly go to freeze collapse. You might feel activated. You might say, okay, no, we're not talking about that. If you're able to do that effectively, and it may take time, and not every relationship will sustain that, but if you're able to do that, that's going to buy you enough safety, potentially, to be able to connect with that if you choose to. And so when we think about aggression, sometimes when we talk about people who are leaving religion, they go through this quote unquote angry phase. And we look at that through a trauma informed lens. And we start seeing that as aggression in this very powerful and visceral way. Like, I will do what's necessary. I will say what's necessary to protect myself. And if that's in the service of connection, of feeling safe again, it can be a really powerful and healing thing. And so I want to just to think about that as a way to support our nervous system, especially when we're in freeze collapse, right? When we need to be activated to move forward. Yeah.
That is so good. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
awesome.
Yeah, I know this time has just flown by. We want to give folks a chance to ask questions. I know Kendra and Kayla were collecting some questions, and so we have those here in a separate document. We'll kind of read through some of those now, and feel free to continue asking questions in the chat. I want to let folks know too that we may not get to every question because it may take a while, but we're going to keep them in mind, and we're keeping track of those. Like I said, Kayla and Kendra are copying and pasting some of those for us to write a blog post about our next workshop. We can provide more kind of information. So anything that you're sharing, I want you to know that we really appreciate that, and it's really helpful to us. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Go
Brian,
ahead.
since you've been talking, if you want, I can start. You can have a chance.
Absolutely. Yeah, sure.
So Tina from Eugene, Oregon asked, wondering the impact of religious trauma changes, or if the impact of religious trauma changes, depending on whether or not the person abused is still, quote unquote, buying into the system. If so, please share your thoughts on this. So I guess I'll start here.
That's a great question too.
I think it's so good. So I said a while ago, trauma is subjective, right? And so the things that are traumatic for some people may or may not be for other people. And so the impact is also going to be quite subjective, right? And so what I would say to that is that I think creating safety, internal and external safety, is one of the most important things and necessary things in order for healing to happen. I'm not very prescriptive of like, here's what healing has to look like, or this is what trauma therapy needs to look like, or these are the modalities that you have to use. But in my experience, the necessity of internal and external safety is very much needed in order for healing to be able to happen. And so what I found is that when we are still in environments or relationships that are not safe, whether that's because the abuse is still going on or physical needs aren't met or we're on edge or those sorts of things, healing can happen, but it's oftentimes can be much more difficult or not maybe to the extent that it could if our bodies are actually feeling safe. So I don't think there is a black and white answer to that, but I would say we have to look at safety. And if you can feel safe inside of a religious system, then yeah, I do think that healing can happen. If you don't feel safe inside that religious system, I think the healing would be limited, depending on various factors and who you are as an individual.
Yeah. And I would totally agree with that as well. And just to add just a little bit to that, this if sometimes folks will need to go back and to be safe and strong and powerful in the system in order for that to feel like completely safe again. And that can be physically going back into that environment, or it could be kind of having the felt sense experience of that. And it can be a really powerful thing to push someone away, metaphorically, but physically as well, kind of like just pushing your hands away, saying, no, I reject that. This isn't safe. This isn't okay for me. And so, I agree with you, Laura. There's no kind of right answer to that. And it really does depend. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah. Someone asked, what practices or boundaries can we do to ground or protect ourselves with people who are still in a community? And so I think, for me, it's going to depend on where you are physiologically. If you're feeling, powerless and stuck, some of those things we would suggest would be to become activated or powerful and strong again. And so we sometimes have this idea that if we can just calm our bodies and soothe our bodies, that we're going to be safe and okay. But guess what? If you're in freeze collapse, that can feel even more powerless and even more stuck. And so sometimes it requires, instead of this long exhale and this kind of sense of calm and at ease, it can maybe require a quick inhale, like, I need to do something. I need to act, and feeling that kind of, energy and power in your body where you feel like I can do what's necessary. And so, that's a really great question. It's going to be a challenging, it's difficult to answer. However, sometimes just having the experience of noticing that someone's pressing in on me, and if you can see the video, I'm kind of holding my hands by my shoulders, palms forward. And if you're able to kind of push away and say, no, that's not okay. You can't treat me that way. It's not just the words, but it's the physiological experience of that. If you can have the felt sense that when I meet with a believer and I'm feeling threatened or stuck, or I'm feeling they're overpowering me, if you can go into that first by having a sense of this really embodied boundary, like I'm powerful, I'm strong, I can do what's necessary, that can be incredibly helpful. And so there's no kind of short answer to that question, but we would want to be really focused on where you're at in your nervous system before we would say what to do. However, just really briefly, oftentimes the clues of what to do is in how you physically feel, right? If I'm feeling pressed in on, like, I can't breathe, I don't have a voice, I can't say what I need to say, there probably needs to be some kind of action that you're pushing away, right? If there's a sense of, I'm just, all over the place and I just can't feel calm in my body, then maybe there's this kind of bringing things in and feeling, experience is happening within inside my body, and I'm noticing that it's not overwhelming, then I can kind of protect and comfort myself in that way. And so it's really going to depend, but the clues can often be there inside of your physiological experience.
Yeah. Awesome. Brian, how many more questions do you want to do?
I'm happy to go for a few more. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure. Pick one and I'll answer.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we had a hard one for you here.
Okay, great.
Oh, Kate is asking, could you speak to how the application of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, could or would go awry for folks with religious trauma? Yeah, I think it's a really great question.
Thanks for giving me that one.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult one.
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I want to say, like I said before, CBT is a valid therapeutic modality that some people find very helpful. The whole notion of CBT is being able to change your thoughts in order to change your behaviors, cognitive behavioral therapy. And so how could that go awry for somebody who has trauma? It goes back to a little bit of what we were saying, that we don't think ourselves through trauma. Trauma is not in the mind. And so oftentimes I don't know, I guess the way that I would say it is, it might go awry in that it would feel incomplete. It could feel very shameful and very frustrating. I've changed the way that I've thought. Like, I'm thinking about this thing differently, but when I do this thing, my body still has a very visceral response to it. And so an example I might use that I think a lot of people have faced is, we know that in a lot of religiously abusive communities, there is a huge push for sexual purity, of, no engagement with any sort of sexual practice prior to a monogamous heterosexual marriage. And so let's just say that you are you're getting out of that religious system and you rethink what your sexual ethic is and what you want your sexual practices to be. And you engage in a sexual activity that feels safe and consensual and kind of, hits all the things that you're looking for. And you go, I've changed the way that I've thought about this, and now I'm going to act on this. And you're up, or there's a lot of pain, or there's a lot of guilt or shame or anxiety or dissociation where you feel like you're not even in your body. And you go, well, that's weird because I know that I can do this. I know that it's okay, but yet I'm having this adverse response to this experience, despite the way that I've changed how I think about something and then how I'm living it out. And so that can cause a lot of shame and frustration and confusion. Your body can then respond in physiological ways with, whether it's phobias or anxiety or sexual dysfunction or risky behaviors or immunological issues, gastrointestinal issues, all these sorts of things where you go, okay, that's really weird that I've changed the way that I've thought about something, but then all these other things are happening. And so that's where I would say it kind of goes awry in that sense that it might not feel complete, that just shifting the way that you think and behave gets rid of that physiological response that your body has. Does that?
Yeah, no, I love that response. Yeah, and I think that's when you said it feels incomplete. I think sometimes anxiety can live inside of our thoughts, and so if the intrusive thoughts are where you're struggling the most, then cognitive behavioral therapy might be helpful for that. When we start realizing the physiological experience of trauma, it often isn't enough. And in fact, when we're working with CBT, there might be that therapeutic relationship where their nervous system feels safe enough to even talk about these various thoughts and beliefs. If we were to track that independent of the modality itself, we might recognize that that sense of safety is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of recovery and moving forward. Yeah, totally. And there are so many great questions here. I don't even know.
I know.
Where to start. I guess.
Let's do one more.
Okay. Oh. It's so challenging. So I'll let you pick one. Go ahead. We have some.
If you picked a hard one for me, I can pick a hard one for you. Carolyn asks how trauma and chronic illness interact, and she cites the book Pure by Linda K. Klein and You Are Your Own by Jamie Lee Finn.
Yeah.
Both of them are great.
Yeah. So I think the literature shows that, we've done a lot of studies and research with adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs studies, and the more kind of trauma you experience as a child, especially in that developing nervous system state, that often correlates with higher rates of irritable bowel syndrome, chronic pain, various kind of syndrome type experiences where we can't really point to some physiological marker as to like why a person's experiencing that. We notice the physiological load that trauma places on a system. It makes sense that over time that's going to have impact, and it's going to show up in various ways. And so I think the question is, how do they interact? And the research is showing that there's at least a strong correlation, and I think there's a causation as well when we look at how trauma impacts the body over time. So yeah, definitely can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would just maybe add to that too. Oh, sorry. What?
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, one thing that trauma can get a bad rap for is like, oh, why do these things happen to me? But when our nervous system responds that way, it is our nervous system's attempt to keep us alive at any cost. And so sometimes the response that we have may not cognitively make sense, but it is our body's way of saying, this is the thing that needs to happen, or what you need to do in order for us to stay alive in this system. Right. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
Yeah. And I think you and I could geek out about trauma all night. And so totally. I think that kind of honoring your body's response, and it doesn't really intuitively make sense that we would be grateful for a freeze collapse response, because it often feels like the last resort, and it feels incredibly lonely and isolating and unsafe. However, when we're moving through this recovery process, if we can honor our body's response and be grateful, even, which is a challenging thing to be when it comes to that. So I'm grateful that my body had my back in that moment, and I would never want to experience that again. But I'm grateful that my body did what was necessary to survive, even though it didn't allow me to feel safe and to thrive in that setting. And so, I think that seeing it through this lens, as opposed to the lens of the thing itself was what was, the sole cause of my experience, allows us to, honor our physiological response to that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So just one more thing to kind of recap, because someone asked a question. Can you recap the differences between adversive religious experiences, religious trauma, and religious abuse? And because that feels central to the purpose of this workshop, is to create some clarity around these concepts, create some distinctions, notice where they overlap. I think maybe it'd be helpful for us just to comment on that, and then we'll probably have to wrap things up here soon. So thank you so much for being here and being part of this. So how would you kind of thumbnail sketch, distinguish between and how do they overlap this idea of adverse religious experiences, religious abuse, and religious trauma?
Yeah. So I would say religious abuse is a smaller version of adverse religious experiences. That's not to rank things at all. But what I like about the term adverse religious experiences is that it seems to be encompassing of many different experiences, whether that is social, intellectual, physical, physiological, relational, support system, community-wise, racially, culturally, all of these sorts of things, where traditional definitions of abuse tend to be a little bit more limited. And so religious abuse fits within adverse religious experiences, but then adverse religious experiences expands that so that you can go, gosh, like I had this experience and it doesn't fit under some of those traditional definitions of abuse, but my body is still having this physiological response to it. And it helps us be able to just kind of organize and understand, and maybe even take some stigma and shame away from the things that we've happened, and then how our body is responding to that. And then, of course, the trauma piece in that is that the distinction there is that trauma is not the adverse religious experience. It is the physiological response that our body, that our nervous system had to the adverse religious experience.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great. Yeah, I think it's a really great, a really great summary there. And love it. I won't add anything to that. Okay. Well done. Let's just briefly talk about, the Religious Trauma Institute is fairly new. We've I think it's been 25 or 26 days. And, there's over 500 folks who are on our mailing list already and really, excited about what we're doing. And I just want to give folks a sense of like what we have planned and why it might be helpful to stay in touch and to connect with us. So we want to do more of these types of workshops, but maybe think of a similar workshop where it isn't quite so broad, but it really focuses on specific issues, and we kind of dive deep and notice what that experience is like and offer kind of maybe more practical resources. These similar conversations that we're having tonight, but taking a deeper dive. And so that's definitely something that we have planned for the future. And then the clinical trainings for professionals. These will be trainings that are approved by the licensing boards across the country that can be used for continuing education credits for therapists and professionals. And again, applying a range of therapy modalities to religious trauma that can be a way to kind of, expand the resources to survivors, because the more clinicians we have that are trained and understand this, the better it is, the more access survivors will have to good quality care. And so, and then also as part of that, the clinical consultation groups where therapists can get together and consult with each other about cases that, clients are working with and experiences that they're noticing. And this collaboration, this expanding the conversation is a way for us all kind of learn and grow together in ways that moves this conversation forward. And then I think one of the exciting things we're wanting to do as well is the adverse religious experiences. Over the coming weeks and months, we're going to reach out to survivors and have them, compile various types of adverse experiences. We're already connected with some researchers who are doing research in this area, and how can we organize adverse religious experiences in a way that's useful for research purposes, so we can expand our understanding of religious abuse as well as religious trauma. And that's going to be useful. Another thing that we're hoping to do is connect with religious organizations from this kind of harm reduction standpoint. How can organizations be safer for their members? And our goal isn't to stigmatize or pathologize religion categorically, because that feels like that doesn't allow us to have these conversations. That doesn't allow us to say, it's okay that you believe what you believe. And in this particular setting, in this context, that belief can be harmful for some folks. Are you willing to do something about that? We're not saying that you can't believe that or it's not true. We're not having philosophical or theological debates with religious organizations. I don't have any interest in that, because it doesn't feel like it's very productive. But if we can talk about things that we can observe in folks' experience and notice, like, you can do the same thing that you're doing, but without as much harm. It just feels like there's just so much we can do in these areas. And so just to give you a really brief idea of the various things we're focusing on within our work.
Yeah. And we also wanted to let you guys know about the Reclamation Collective. Those are, again, Kendra and Kayla, and they've been moderating our conversation tonight in the chat box. And so, the Reclamation Collective is focusing on doing in-person retreats. And those are coming up. And I'm excited. They've been sharing with us what those are for different groups of people. They're committed to also providing a religious trauma-informed therapist directory, which is amazing, because these are therapists who have experience and certification both in trauma-informed therapeutic modalities, as well as experience in religious trauma. And the goal is to get people from every state that is a part of this directory, so that if you live in Kentucky or Vermont or Arizona or wherever you are, that you could connect with somebody in your state. And then they also do real quick.
I just want to interject, because within the secular community, there's the Secular Therapy Project, and the main criteria to be on that directory is to be secular, to not be religious. And we're wanting a directory that's really focused on folks who understand trauma. It's not enough to not be religious. Well, I shouldn't even say it that way. It's not even important to not be religious necessarily, right? It may be important to disclose that to a client you're working with. But there's a lot of folks who've experienced religious trauma who are within a religious system and plan to stay. And to say that being secular is the thing that's required to treat religious trauma is just to not understand trauma. And so I wanted to make that clear why this is important to us and why we're wanting to support the Reclamation Collective's initiative to provide support in training for folks so they can actually be trauma informed. Yeah.
And we'll be partnering with the Reclamation Collective to do trainings for the therapists that are a part of that directory. Yeah. So it's going to be awesome to collaborate with them. And then they also do some amazing support groups. Some of them are in person. A lot of them are online as a way to connect with survivors for various things that are a part of religious trauma. And so I'm just going to plug their social media. They are, at Reclamation Collective on Instagram, and they also have a private Facebook page that you can be a part of. And so, and then they will have a website coming in 2020, early 2020. It'll be reclamationcollective.com. So you can be connecting with them and their amazing resources, and we'll continue to plug them as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I see folks in the chat there are a lot of therapists in the chat, which is amazing. And I'm so glad you're here because we want to kind of learn and grow together and provide the support and training. And so if you are wanting to connect with us, the best way to do that, and even to learn about the Reclamation Collective, is to sign up. Likely you've already signed up, but if you go to our website, we allow you to kind of decide, what kind of subcategory fits you best, and if you're interested in if you're a licensed mental health professional or a graduate student in training, and you want to learn more of these kind of clinical tools to work with folks who've experienced religious trauma. Get on our email update list. We haven't done a lot with it yet, but we have a lot of really amazing things planned, and you'll be the first to know when we have additional trainings and so forth. Yeah. And then follow us as well. Over the last 25 days, we have almost 1,000 followers on Instagram and approaching 800 or 900 on Facebook. We'd love to see you there. On Twitter, we're also there. So to connect with us on social media, to share our content, that's super, super helpful. And we really appreciate you supporting us in that way. And with deepest gratitude, we just really, really are grateful that you're here, that you care about this topic, that you're interested in the work that we're doing. And we want to be a resource for you and connect in ways that are meaningful and helpful for you.
Yeah.
Yay.
Thank you guys so much for participating in this. This is just amazing. And we are just blown away at how many people found this to be important enough to give up their Thursday evening to spend with us. So thank you.